How many of you were at the march today? All right. What a day. Sometimes the heavens just conspire to make the most glorious day ever. And today was one of those days. I don't know how many of you know me, but I'm Andy Shallal. I'm the owner of Busboys and Poets. And I'm thrilled and excited to be here. This is one of the, I tell you, I have the best job in the world. To be able to be amongst such beautiful people all the time. This is what our community looks like all the time. This is what the world should look like. This is what DC should look like. This is what everything around us should look like. I think we all would probably agree. I moved to this country in 1966. The march happened in 1963. I wasn't here at that time. In 1966, when I moved to this country, I learned about this thing called race. I had no idea what the fuck people were talking about. And I learned about race in a very strange way when I got enrolled in school and I had to check white or black. I turned mine unchecked. I had no idea what to put down. And it's been an interesting conversation that I've had internally and externally about this issue of race. Race is everything in America. It's so pervasive, it's like air. It certainly is in this city. When my family moved here, we lived in Virginia in 1966, it was illegal for a black person and a white person to marry and live together in Virginia in 1966. A lot of young people can't imagine that, but that's true. We are certainly a lot closer to the idea of equality, but we are still a ways away from justice. And I want to be able to say that because it's in light of what just came out with the Washington Lawyers Committee on Civil Rights, that report that just came out about the numbers of incarcerations that happen in this city and the disproportionate number of African Americans that get arrested. And there's some interesting statistics. In this city, 1 out of every 3 black men has been to jail. Now, I want you to think about that for a minute. 17% of every black person in the city has been to jail. We have poverty in this city, but it just happens to be 98% of poor people are black people in this city. In many cities. I know DC. And I can just tell you the reality of that. The fact of the matter is that we continue business as usual is really quite disturbing and certainly tugs at my heart and my soul and my mind. It's something that I don't want to see continue. This is a situation that is not tenable, a situation that's not sustainable. We are all in on this. This is not just one person's problem. When our chief of police says that she doesn't see color, I admire the fact that she's able to do that. But at the same time, it really is disturbing because color is real. In this country, in this city, right now today, color is very real because even though drug use among white people and black people is the same, black people are arrested 85% of the time. These are not just accidental numbers. These are numbers that have been going on and increasing. This war on poverty has turned to war against the poor. And in this city, when you say war against the poor, it means war against black people. Because whether you're a poor black person or a wealthy black person, to a cop, you're a black person. And that's what they see first. These arrests continue to happen. So it's not just about having more laws. We know what laws can do. It's really about having justice. So this is what we need to focus on today in this historic moment. I want to be able to bring up to the stage someone who's going to MC the program for the rest of the day, and that's Brian Jones. He's a teacher, activist, educator. He's a great person, and Brian and I go a little bit back. I think I reminded him a little bit when the great late Howard Zinn wrote a play called Marx in Soho. I told him I wanted to produce it. So I was the first producer of that play. We produced it here in Washington, D.C., and we had this guy by the name of Will Moynihan was the first guy who played the role of Marx. And then the show went on the road and made history, and it's played hundreds of times, if not thousands of times by now, all over the country, all over the world. He's played it everywhere, and the guy who took it to the road is Brian Jones. He is a remarkable actor, and I remember meeting Roz Zinn one time after we had already produced it, and she says, "He's so much better than your guy." And I agree. He has done an incredible job with this amazing play to be able to share the stories that Howard Zinn wanted us all to know about. So I'd like to bring up to the stage now the one, the only, Brian Jones.
Thanks, bro. Andy Shallal, my publicist, ladies and gentlemen. I just want, hello, as Andy said, my name is Brian Jones. Welcome to this event. For those who are watching on the live stream at home, I'm not sure if you're aware of just how many people are here at Busboys and Poets. This is not your normal Busboys and Poets event because we have people all, I just want to paint a picture for you at home. We have people all over the bar, people all over the staircase, people who are not even in Busboys and Poets, but they've gathered from outside the fence and the patio. So please just make some noise for a minute for the folks watching the live stream if you're here for this event right now. That might give you a sense of just how many people are here. The event that we're here for is called MLK, Trayvon, and the fight against racism today. First off, of course, we have to give thanks to the incredible people here at Busboys and Poets for hosting us and agreeing to do this unconventional event in this unconventional way, especially Andy Shallal, Layla Shallal, and Pam Pinnock we want to thank. Please give them a round of applause. And also, I want to draw your attention to the people who really organized the event and who organized the live stream, and that is Haymarket Books, publishers of a book and a few books I'm going to talk about in a minute, and wearemany.org, which is, if any of you are here and you have friends who want to watch this at home, please text or tweet or Facebook them right now to go to wearemany.org. That's where your friends and family and coworkers and colleagues can pick up the live stream. Let's give a round of applause to Haymarket Books and wearemany.org. Thank you. As you know, we're here, and I say this for those who are watching not just in a different place, but maybe we're watching this in a different time, that we are gathered here because of the 50th anniversary of the 1963 March on Washington. It happened in August of 1963, and we're here in August of 2013, in some ways commemorating that march. And when I was out there today with tens of thousands of others, I don't know if we even have a count yet, but it seemed to me to be quite large. It seemed also that there was a widespread agreement that the dream that Dr. King dreamed is not yet fulfilled. And I say that at the same time, I think we have to acknowledge that there was a broad spectrum of ideas about where we are in this country and about how our moment today connects to the moment of 1963. On the one hand, there were people there wearing T-shirts with Obama's face and Dr. King's face together, and with slogans and banners that very much suggested that they strongly believe that President Obama, not just in his election, but in his presidency as it has unfolded, represents in some sense a continuation of the aspirations or the promise of the historic civil rights movement for justice and equality. On the other hand, I would say, besides those two faces, the other face that I saw on T-shirts, on placards and signs, more perhaps than those two, or as much, was the face of Trayvon Martin. So many thousands of people came out to this march today, in some ways to criticize the current administration, to say that there is not enough being done for African Americans, for young people who can literally be killed with impunity in August of 2013. Some people are critical of Obama on the other end of the spectrum, of the Democratic Party, and some even of our own underlying social order and economics. We here today have a fantastic panel to try to discuss these issues, to try to discuss with us what it means to look back on that 1963 moment and try to learn something about what we have to do today in 2013. I don't know if people here know him, but he's about to come up. We have Gary Younge about to speak up here. Okay, so you do know him. That's good. We have the amazing Keeanga-Taylor, who's going to come up after him. And rounding out our program this evening is Dr. Cornel West. Now, limitations of the live stream format and even of this incredible space and crowd that we have are going to prevent us from having a whole lot of discussion. So for the purposes of the live stream and the logistics of the space, we're going to have each of these three speakers. And then we're going to cut off the live stream, and as much as time allows, maybe if you stay put, we'll allow for some questions and some back and forth. After that, after we have discussion and we wrap it up and applaud everyone and decide to go home, those of you who want to pick up this book can line up over there by the elevators and have Gary Younge sign it. I want to draw your attention to this book for a minute. This is The Speech, the story behind Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s dream. This is I can't recommend this enough. It's a very brisk read, and it's a book that tries to delve into that moment in 1963 and understand it in light of our present predicaments. It's perceptive and thought-provoking, and the author of this book, this brand new book, The Speech, is Gary Younge. Please welcome him to the stage right now.
A little bit smaller than Brian. Thank you, Brian. Thank you, Busboys. I think it's really important in a moment like this, 50 years on, all of the kind of the black and white tape that's been rolling for almost a week on cable TV and elsewhere, not to mistake nostalgia with history or nostalgia with analysis, and understand that this is a different time. And in the words of Sade, it's never as good as the first time. So we can't replicate that moment. But there's the great African proverb that only when lions write history will hunters cease to be the heroes. And here, with Dr. Cornel West and Dr. Keeanga-Taylor and myself, we're going to try and be the lions tonight. That's our aim. That's our goal. To talk about how it was and how it is. And I think one place to start, because I've been interviewed by some people on the left and had conversations with people who I wanted to say, do you think even Dr. King would be invited to this march? Do you think that if he was invited, would he invite these people? Would he invite Obama? And a sense that like somehow, and this is people on the left, somehow there was something just a little bit lame about this whole enterprise. And to that notion, I want to say, look, we're living in a country where some people truly believe that we're in a post-racial society, that there are some people who truly believe that there must have been some justification out there somewhere for Zimmerman to shoot a young boy on his way home from the store, that somehow we are over this thing. That's how it was presented to the Supreme Court when they gutted the Voting Rights Act. There was a problem, the lawyer said, and it's over. And so when tens of thousands of people come to Washington to protest racism and to demand jobs, then clearly we've shown them that it's not over. As far as we're concerned, it's very much not over. Now, back in '63, as they built the coalition to create this march, Bayard Rustin each day would talk to his young workers in the organizing center in Harlem. And he would say originally they were going to march on Washington. They were going to snarl up the traffic. They were going to get in the congressmen's faces. There was going to be an unemployed worker speaking. And each day he would come back and say, okay, we've got to drop this, and we're going to drop this, and we're going to drop the other. And the youngsters would shout, oh man, you're turning it into a circus. They would cry, sell out. And so there are probably people here today, left-wing as they are, who may not have made that march, who may have decided that it was, even in '63, that it was too weak, that it was, or that they were too strong. But there was one thing that Bayard Rustin insisted on, and he said no politicians, no paid politicians will speak from the stage. That was one concession he was not prepared to make, because the march was about talking truth to power, not about giving the powerful a podium from which they could sell their lives. And that's one big difference between the march then and the march now. But also, as we reflect on it and we look at the way it's been packaged, and I would call it misremembered, we see this sense of, or an attempt to paint this march as a huge patriotic moment, a moment when Americans came together for a day to challenge this bad thing. That people try and wrap this march in the flag and sell it back to us as a wonderful patriotic moment in America. And they can't do that. We can't let them do that. What this march was a massive multiracial dissident act. It was a radical act, and nobody wanted it to happen. Kennedy didn't want it to happen. The Justice Department put a kill switch on the mic that day for fear that someone would call for insurrection. And they planned to play Mahalia Jackson singing "He's Got the Whole World in His Hands" if anybody cut up rough from the mic. They policed the march in '63 like it was a military operation, literally. It was called Operation Steep Hill. They had helicopters ready to go. They had boxcars, flying boxcars ready to go. They had something in the order of 30,000 troops ready to descend on D.C. and quell what they thought was going to be a violent act. There was no violence that day. Only 3 people from 250,000 were arrested. And as it happens, they were all white. So where did that moment come from? And here, I'm just going to read a little bit from the book that describes the tumult, really, of that very particular period. And it starts with an interview I had with Franklin McCain. Franklin McCain was one of the 4 kids, young kids, 17, 18, who went into Woolworths in Greensboro, North Carolina, and made a stand by taking a seat. And Franklin McCain, he told me that his parents had sold him this lie that he could do what he wanted to do, that he could be anything he wanted to be. And as he grew up into a young black man, he realized that this was not true, and he even contemplated suicide. And so when it came to the moment when they would sit down, he said, we wanted to go beyond what our parents had done. And the worst thing that could happen was that the Klan could kill us. But I had no concern for my personal safety because I had already considered suicide. The day I sat at that counter, I had the most tremendous feeling of elation and celebration. I felt that in this life, nothing else mattered. If there's a heaven, I got there for a few minutes. I just felt that you can't touch me, you can't hurt me. There's been no other experience like it. He said it surpassed even the birth of his firstborn child. A few months later, in May 1963, in Birmingham, Alabama, a burly white police officer attempted to intimidate some black schoolchildren to keep them from joining the growing anti-segregation protests. They assured him they knew what they were doing, ignored his entreaties, and continued their march toward Kelly Ingram Park, where they were arrested. A reporter asked one of them her age. 6, she said, as she climbed into the paddy wagon. The next month in Mississippi, a stalwart civil rights campaigner, Fannie Lou Hamer, overheard Anel Ponder being beaten in jail in an adjacent cell. "Can you say yes, sir, nigger? Can you say yes, sir?" the policeman demanded. "Yes, I can," she said. "So say it." "I don't know you well enough," said Ponder. All books about all revolutions, wrote the Polish journalist Ryszard Kapuscinski, begin with a chapter that describes the decay of a tottering authority or the misery and sufferings of the people. But they should begin with a psychological chapter, one that shows how a harassed, terrified man suddenly breaks his terror, stops being afraid. This unusual process demands illuminating. Man gets rid of fear and feels free. Now, the period preceding King's speech at the March on Washington was one such chapter. Until that point, there had, of course, been many fearless acts by anti-racist protesters. But in that moment, the number who were prepared to commit them reached a critical mass. In May '63, the New York Times published more stories about civil rights in 2 weeks than it had in the previous 2 years. According to the Justice Department, during the 10-week period following Kennedy's national address on civil rights in June, just before King's speech, there were 758 demonstrations in 180 cities, resulting in 14,733 arrests. And that context was global. 2 days after McCain made his protest in Greensboro, the British Prime Minister Harold Macmillan addressed the South African Parliament in Cape Town with an ominous warning. "The wind of change is blowing through this continent," he said. "Whether we like it or not, this growth of national consciousness is a political fact." They didn't like it, and it happened anyway. As the decade wore on, the wind became a gale. In the 3 years between Macmillan's speech and the March on Washington, Togo, Mali, Senegal, Zaire, Somalia, Benin, Niger, Burkina Faso, Cote d'Ivoire, Chad, Central African Republic, Congo, Gabon, Nigeria, Mauritania, Sierra Leone, Tanganyika, and Jamaica all became free. Internationally, non-racial democracy and the black enfranchisement that came with it were the order of the day. The longer America practiced legal segregation, the more it looked like a slum on the wrong side of history than a shining city on the hill. Now, that was the time. That was the moment. And all of those examples of the 6-year-old, of the woman saying, "I don't know you well enough," these were examples of the grassroots really running away from the leadership. That what we get in '63 is the leadership, King, Roy Wilkins of the NAACP, the Urban League, running to catch up as the impatience of black communities outstrips the politics that they had set down. In '63, King speaks in New York and is heckled by people shouting, "We want Malcolm." The first black flight attendant attends the March on Washington and says, "You know, I like King, but I'm more of a Malcolm X kind of person." And throughout that time, the Kennedy administration fears what happens if everything spins out of control. And so at the beginning of the year, they didn't want to march. King wasn't that interested. Wilkins wanted to do something with Kennedy. It was 100 years since the Emancipation Proclamation. Whitney Young of the Urban League was worried about his nonprofit status and wasn't interested. And then after Birmingham, they have to have a march because they don't know what else to do. And so while we tell the story all too often of great men and all too rarely of great women, one thing that we forget are the hundreds and thousands, the young, the people who made that possible, that 6-year-old, the kids in Birmingham, the woman whose name you don't know, who said, "I will not say yes, sir," and so on and so forth. That history is made by these people. It's not handed to them by the people that we have heard of. So 63 was really a set of demands in search of a march. The demands were out there for equality and for justice and for jobs. And in the end, they realized that they had to have this march, come hell or high water. Today, I think, and here I want us to be somewhat reflective, what we have is a march in search of demands that I saw lots of different people arguing and calling for lots of different things. And it was, as Brian points out, telling that of all the faces on this march, Trayvon Martin's was, I think, the most prominent, or at least it vied with King. Now, some of us want to challenge stop and frisk. Some of us want to control gun laws. I saw demands for marijuana, for ecology. I saw a whole range of demands that, if we're honest, has failed so far to coalesce into an achievable aim. In a sense, and I count myself in this, we want everything because we want justice. But trying to work out what justice looks like in a moment when racism has taken the form that it has is tricky. It's not the same fight that we had in 63. I just want to give a small quote from Bayard Rustin. Bayard Rustin was the out, gay, pacifist organizer of the March on Washington, all too often marginalized. And he was a brilliant man. And like many brilliant black men, he was brilliant because he did not know his place. And when he was told his place, he wouldn't keep to it. This is from an article he wrote in 65 called From Protest to Power. It says the civil rights movement is evolving from a protest movement into a full-fledged social movement, an evolution calling its very name into question. It is now concerned not merely with removing the barriers to full opportunity, but with achieving the fact of equality. From sit-ins and freedom rides, we have gone into rent strikes, boycotts, community organizations, and political action. And as a consequence of this natural evolution, the Negro today finds himself stymied by obstacles of far greater magnitude than the legal barriers he was attacking before. Automation, urban decay, de facto school segregation. That sounds familiar. These are problems which, while conditioned by Jim Crow, do not vanish upon its demise. They are more deeply rooted in our socio-economic order. They are the result of the total society's failure to meet not only the Negro's demands, but human needs generally. Now, I think that what Bayard Rustin is talking about there is a shift, an important shift to grasp between the systematic and the systemic, between having signs up saying no blacks allowed and finding another way, a more subtle way, an implicit way to make sure blacks don't get in. That if we talk for a moment about Trayvon Martin and George Zimmerman, Trayvon Martin does not have to be an angel in order to get home that night. And George Zimmerman does not have to be a bad person to attack him, because these problems are systemic. What Zimmerman did was a freelance stop and frisk that became a stop and shoot and a stop and kill. If Zimmerman had a uniform, we would be having a slightly different conversation. It wouldn't be any less wrong, but we would be having a different conversation. And so to concentrate on these, on the individuals, of course, the individual case and the horror for Trayvon Martin's parents and his life, all significant. But to pretend somehow, some way, that Zimmerman had to wake up and think, I'm going to kill myself a black boy today, that's not how it happened. That's not how it needed to happen. That Trayvon Martin, historically, couldn't present his free papers when Zimmerman came and attacked. He couldn't justify his presence. And I don't think there are many black people here who haven't at some time or another had to justify their presence somewhere that they had a right to be. So racism becomes more subtle. And this is not an accident. It's like Jim Crow had a son, and the son was more polite. He knew not to use cuss words. He put his white hoodie in the wardrobe and left it for private parties. He did not put up signs, and Jim Crow Sr. denied paternity. But we see the genealogy of this moment, and we know that there is a connection. This from one of Reagan's advisors, Lee Atwater, used to be the chair of the Republican National Committee, describing the shift in messaging. He says, you start out in 1954 by saying nigger, nigger, nigger. By 68, you can't say nigger. That hurts you, it backfires. So you say stuff like forced busing and states' rights. You're getting so abstract now that you're talking about cutting taxes, and all those things that you're talking about are totally economic things, and a byproduct of them is that blacks get hurt worse than whites. Now, obviously, sitting around saying, we want to cut this, is much more abstract than even the busing thing, and a hell of a lot more abstract than nigger, nigger. They know what they're doing. They know what they're doing, and we need to be aware of what they're doing. And in a way, the useful fact for us is that these things started as a dog whistle, but then they became so familiar that it just turned into a straight-up whistle. When we can all hear it, it's not a dog whistle anymore. It's just a whistle. Now, the other thing that's happened is we moved to a place where individuals can advance. It is possible. So long as they don't take anyone with them, individuals can advance. And so we move to a place where we end up really talking about photo opportunities rather than equal opportunities, where we want to look different and act the same. I interviewed Angela Davis, and she was talking about the Bush administration, and she had this to say. We have more black people in more visible and powerful positions, but then we have more black people who've been pushed down to the bottom of the ladder. And when people call for diversity and link it to justice and equality, that's fine. But as a model of diversity, as the difference that makes no difference, the change that brings no change. And then Arundhati Roy, the Indian writer, was talking about the pardoning of the Thanksgiving turkey and comparing that to the way that America understands or can misunderstand race. And she did this in an essay called Do Turkeys Enjoy Thanksgiving? And she said, a few carefully bred turkeys, Colin Powell, Condoleezza Rice, are given absolution and a pass to Frying Pan Park. But the remaining millions lose their jobs, are evicted from their homes, have their water and electricity connections cut, and die of AIDS. Basically, they're for the pot. Who can say that turkeys are against Thanksgiving? They participate in it. And so I just want to wind up by saying that we're in a moment where things are more, and it's been this way for a while, where things are more subtle, but as we know, no less deadly and no less terrible, that the discrepancy between black and white in terms of employment is the same now than it was in '63. The discrepancy in wealth between black and white is actually greater now than it was in '63. We would be spitting on the graves of those who marched in 50 years if we said that nothing had changed. But we would be dishonoring them if we said that we had reached anywhere near our goal. King did not dream of better people. He dreamt of a better system. And we have yet to create that system. Thank you very much.
Wow, thank you, Gary Younge. I forgot to say that Gary Younge, in addition to being an activist and a broadcaster, is an award-winning journalist with the Guardian newspaper. Let's hear it again for Gary Younge. Before I call up our next speaker, I want to acknowledge some people who made a special trip here to be with us today. We have already spoken about the case of Trayvon Martin, whose murderer was exonerated under Florida's Stand Your Ground statute. But there's another Trayvon. Really, there's countless Trayvons. But I want to draw your attention to the case of Jordan Davis. Jordan Davis was a 17-year-old African-American young man in Florida who was shot dead in November of 2012 by a white man named Michael Dunn, who complained that Jordan was playing his music too loud. Michael Dunn fired 10 bullets at a car playing the music that was backing away from him and is now trying to defend himself in Florida court under the same statute that he was the one standing his ground. Please give a round of applause to Jordan's family who are here to join us today and show solidarity. Thank you. And the little that I hope this does something to help this struggle. They have a website, and anyone who wants to express solidarity with them, get in touch with them, support these brave family members who are fighting back for justice for Jordan. Their website is called walkwithjordan.org. I'm going to say it again. walkwithjordan.org. Please visit that website if you or someone you know, or spread it around if you know people who want to help get involved and show solidarity and fight this case, because it's not just Trayvon Martin, and it's not just Jordan Davis, it's the whole deadly climate where people can kill our young black people with impunity. That has to stop. Next up, we have a very powerful speaker and a good friend of mine, an activist and writer whose work and writing and speaking on race and class and racism in the 21st century especially has been really invaluable to me, and I know to countless others who know her name and who follow her stuff. She's also on the editorial board of the International Socialist Review magazine. Please welcome up to the stage Keeanga-Yamahtta Taylor.
Hello. Okay. Okay. Today, tens of thousands of African Americans converged on the nation's capital to remember and pay homage to the 1963 March on Washington. But it would be a mistake to think that most of the people out there today made their way to Washington, D.C. to simply stroll down memory lane. Instead, today's march included renewed calls from the grassroots, from the thousands of people who made their way, for action to respond to the numerous social crises that consume Black communities across the country. The political demands intimated on the handmade signs of thousands of ordinary Black folk at today's march mark a painful and damning continuity with the recent past of 1963. The march in 1963 was called to address the twin evils of racism and economic deprivation that were sharply defining all of American society, not just the South. 100 years after the emancipation, King reminded the nation that, quote, the Negro is still not free. The signs today demanding housing and jobs and an end to police brutality, or what we call today the new Jim Crow, show clearly that as many things have changed since 1963, much remains the same. 150 years after emancipation from slavery, and 50 years after the largest and most powerful demonstration for civil rights in this country's history, for millions of African Americans, King's dream, a dream that is deeply entangled with the American dream, a dream of freedom, justice, and democracy, has instead been replaced by an American nightmare. A nightmare of poverty, a nightmare of unemployment, and a nightmare of police brutality, racial profiling, stop and frisk, all of which has fed a frenzy of mass incarceration that has destroyed the lives of too many of our people. In effect, the promise of freedom, democracy, and justice has instead been replaced by a nightmare of racism, inequality, and injustice. And this summer has been a powerful reminder that equality and justice remain fleeting. The Supreme Court gutted the most significant aspects of the Voting Rights Act, a centerpiece of the Southern civil rights struggle. And while Chief Justice Roberts claimed that, quote, things have changed as a pretext for gutting the Voting Rights Act, this was happening while Republicans were tripping over themselves, congratulating themselves in their attempts to restrict Black access to the vote. But really, it was the acquittal of George Zimmerman that has shown once again for the entire world to see the cheap regard with which Black life is held in this country. In 1953, the murder of Emmett Till threatened the United States' self-appointed position as leader of the free world. If a country purporting to be the beacon of democracy for the world could not even guarantee the health, safety, and well-being of a Black child on summer vacation, then why was this country preaching to anyone about freedom and democracy? Trayvon Martin is our Emmett Till, a Black child stalked, racially profiled, and then murdered, and then in death, deeply betrayed by a justice system that is so conditioned to find Black males guilty of anything that it could not even begin to comprehend Trayvon as a victim, as worthy of humanity and justice. And so today again, the United States continues to wag its finger at countries around the world preaching about democracy and freedom while it still cannot guarantee the health, safety, and well-being of a Black child 58 years after the murder of Emmett Till. So there is much continuity between today and the civil rights era that produced the march 50 years ago. But there are also important differences that we must take stock of. The most important of which is that today, this inequality and injustice is happening in the 5th year of the presidency of Barack Obama, the nation's first Black president. And we have to say that despite his election to that office, things have not gotten better for African Americans. They have gotten worse. By every measure, every statistical measure of quality of life in this country, things have gotten worse for Black people. Now, Obviously, this cannot all be laid at the feet of Obama when Congress is filled with Neanderthals that call the Republican Party home. But at the same time, all too often, this president is all too willing to engage in the tired old stereotypes and cliches that hard work and, quote, no excuses can overcome racial inequality. And in this way, Obama contributes to the discourse that reduces racism to an individual problem that can either be overcome or succumb to. But in minimizing the overwhelming, all-encompassing, institutional nature of racism in American society, he reproduces the absurdity that we live in a post-racial or colorblind society. And the talk of the U.S. as post-racial or even colorblind should not be misinterpreted as simply naive or misinformed understanding of the real race politics in this country. Instead, the promotion of post-racial or colorblind U.S. is a deliberate effort to strip the federal government and the private institutions that profit from this society from bearing any responsibility for the conditions that exist in African American, poor, and working class communities across the country. Instead of accepting this responsibility, for the 40 years since the end of the black freedom struggles of the 1960s, we have been told two truths. That the absence of Jim Crow and legal discrimination means that if you work hard, you can overcome and be successful in this country. And the second is the inverse. That if you aren't successful or if you haven't overcome, it's because you haven't worked hard. And in both of these cases, whether you rise or fall in American society is reduced to your individual abilities and talents. It is a lie that is central to the mythology of the American dream. It is the lie that hard work will set you free. It is also quite simply a way of blaming African Americans for the disproportionate conditions of inequality that persists throughout Black America. Because simply signing a bill that outlaws intentional acts of racism does not undo the impact of centuries of racial oppression. Public and private institutions in the United States, born, raised, and nourished on 400 years of white supremacy, slavery, and Jim Crow, do not simply leave that legacy behind after only 4 decades of formal equality. Racism and discrimination is so tightly wound into the blood and marrow of so-called American democracy that it can hardly function without it. And politicians and pundits from across the political spectrum, from Democrats and Republicans to the Black president himself, regularly condescend to and blame Black people for the very conditions that are a product of this oppression and inequality. It is amazing that some of the most educated people in the world, when called upon to explain the persistence of inequality in the U.S., are reduced to incoherent and nonsensical blustering. They insist that Black poverty is worse because of a lack of role models in Black communities. They blame Black parents. They blame sagging pants. They say work harder, as if the best parenting in the world or the best fitting pants in the world can bridge the financial gap between the $11,000 a year the U.S. spends on public school students compared between the $11,000 a year the U.S. spends per public school student compared to the $30,000 a year the U.S. spends to keep someone in prison. As if the best role models in the world or the most informed parents could stop the Chicago Board of Education from closing 54 schools in predominantly Black communities. As if it could stop Philadelphia school authorities from closing 28 schools and laying off 4,000 workers in the public school system, while at the same time, the state of Pennsylvania spent $400 million on the construction of a new prison outside of Philadelphia. And so you see, the failure of one will lead to the success of another. And they closed our schools while Michelle Obama goes around the country saying too many of our kids want to be ballers and rappers and don't care about education, while at the same time they're closing the schools. And so the rhetoric of this self-help suggests individual effort and willpower alone can make a substantial difference in the overwhelming structural inequality in black communities, while simultaneously concluding that it is a lack of effort or hard work that caused the conditions to arise in the first place. And not only is this classic victim blaming, but it ignores other truths. That being poor in the richest country in the world is hard work. That trying to feed your children on the paltry allowance for food stamps is hard work. That trying to pay the rent on time when you are unemployed or underemployed is hard work. And it is even harder work when you are suffering from depression, anxiety, and stress because you are told that your struggles are your own fault in the first place. But the victim blaming and demonization that regularly takes place in politics and the media today is meant to undermine the notion that the state or the federal government should or even can play any role in undoing these conditions. Instead, we are seeing from around the country the only real public policy being enacted is an intensification of policing and repression. Police are used to maintain the boundaries that keep some neighborhoods and people who live in those neighborhoods from encroaching on the gentrified, rich areas of town where the real revenue is going. And that is simply because they don't have a plan for disposable communities that are filled with disposable people. And so when you close down the public schools, when you shut down the public housing, consolidate the public hospitals, close the public libraries, close the public clinics, it means you are creating a city for populations that don't rely on public services. And this is not just a continuation of the attacks of the past, but it represents new ways in the post-segregation era that black life is under attack, all the while race is never mentioned. But these are not just black problems. Those who run this country have long mastered using race, whether spoken or not only to divide a potential opposition to their plans, but to also implement policies and practices that were intended for one group while quietly being implemented for all. And so they use racism to explain away why they are closing all these public institutions that disproportionately service and assist African Americans. They are also legitimizing the idea that there should be no public services for anyone. So for the 20 million white people who live below the poverty line, and the 76% of whites who will experience joblessness, welfare, or other economic insecurity sometime over the course of their life, the acceptance of racism helps to justify the cutting of the very services and institutions that could mitigate the impact of the growing economic inequality they are facing because of an economy that privileges and benefits the rich and wealthy far beyond the vast majority of us. Understanding the ways in which both our oppression and struggles against oppression are linked is not about subsuming any one struggle for another. It is about coming to terms with a simple equation. How does the parasitic, socially useless 1% maintain their power and control over the 99%? It is divide and conquer. It is divide and conquer. This is why solidarity cannot be interpreted as charity that some have the luxury of extending while others do not. Solidarity is integral to either the success or failure of our movements against oppression and exploitation. And that said, it still leaves the critical question posed by Dr. Martin Luther King in 1967. Where do we go from here? I don't purport to have all the answers to that very complicated question, but I will suggest that the answer is both a political one as well as an activist one. Politically, we must reassert racism as a defining feature of American society. We must reject these attempts to explain inequality and discrimination in this country as an issue of personal responsibility, individual will, and talent. Racial discrimination explains why blacks experience poverty, unemployment, incarceration, substandard housing, substandard health care, foreclosures, and evictions at a higher rate than anyone else in this country. Economic inequality is a result of the racial inequality that defines American society. Black people are poor because they are black. Black people are unemployed because they are black. And the sooner people come to terms with this reality, the sooner we can disabuse ourselves of this ridiculous notion that we live in a colorblind or post-racial society. But we must do more than diagnose a problem. We must act, and we must act with what Dr. King described as the fierce urgency of now. The feeling of constantly being under siege can sow the illusion that maybe struggles don't matter, or that maybe we need to find a new way, elect an honest politician, or even a black president. But without struggle, there is no progress. The fight today is not the same as it was before. We are confronted by new attacks, but we still must throw ourselves into these small, local struggles to fight to keep our schools open today, to keep our hospitals and libraries open today, and to stop the evictions and foreclosures that threaten to undo our communities. But while fighting our local battles and struggles, we must also raise the larger questions. What kind of organizations and leaderships do we need? Today, too many civil rights leaders are more concerned about their proximity to power and the White House than they are concerned about placing demands on the presidency. That it's easy to call for a march on Washington to commemorate a march that happened 50 years ago, but it is much harder to build a movement for racial justice. And we need more than marches. We need a movement for jobs, a movement to end evictions and foreclosures, a movement to end racial profiling and police murder and the racist death penalty. Because in essence, the Negro is still not free. And we have to begin to grapple with the political questions and strategies that are necessary to create a new freedom movement. And in order to do that, we have to understand the nature of our oppression. And we must create a leadership that reflects the best that our local movements have produced. From the grassroots activists who have led the fight against evictions and foreclosures, to the families of victims of police murder and brutality, to the activists in New York who led the fight against stop and frisk, to the rank and file teachers of Chicago and Philadelphia who are leading the struggle against corporate school reform and who are fighting for public education. They all are the constituent parts to what could constitute a new movement against racism and inequality in this country. And the connections between these different movements and small groups have to be developed, our communication has to be encouraged, and we can begin to knit together a genuine alternative to a leadership that is so beholden and enmeshed with the Democratic Party today that it can barely function without its permission. But the exclusive focus on our individual struggles is not alone enough either. When King asked the question of where do we go from here, he raised critical issues that are just as important today. And I'm going to end with a quote from King, a speech that we often don't hear from, but one that was delivered to the Southern his organization in 1967, a year before he died. When raising the question of where do we go from here, he said, quote, "We honestly face the fact that the movement must address itself to the question of restructuring the whole of American society. There are 40 million poor people here, and one day we must ask the question, why are there 40 million poor people in America? And when you begin to ask that question, you are raising questions about the economic system, about a broader distribution of wealth. When you ask that question, you begin to question the capitalistic economy. And I'm simply saying that more and more, we've got to begin to ask questions about the whole society. We are called upon to help the discouraged beggars in life's marketplace. But one day, we must come to see that an edifice which produces beggars needs restructuring. It means that this question, you begin to ask, who owns the oil? You begin to ask the question, who owns the iron ore? You begin to ask the question, why is it that people have to pay water bills in a world that is 2/3 water? And what I am saying today is that we must go from here and say, America, you must be born again. Thank you.
Yes. Yes. Thank you, Keeanga-Yamahtta Taylor. So, yeah. If you want to know more about that idea about economic restructuring of America that King talked about, it turns out that it wasn't just King, it was Rustin and Randolph and many of the leading lights of the civil rights movement who were up there in '63. Actually, their vision was not privatization and gentrification or any of the things that are happening today, but to defy the logic of the market and provide things for people. They had a plan that they called a freedom budget for all Americans. And it included things like, that they were fighting for in '63, that they wrote down, it included things like universal health care for everybody. This new book by Paul LeBlanc and Michael Yates, called A Freedom Budget for All Americans, talks about that plan and that history and what it was that these civil rights figures that you know of as dreamers and peaceful and love and whatever were trying to do to change the system itself that we live under. I want to also draw your attention to this book, Troy Davis. For those who don't know, it was September of 2011 that Troy Anthony Davis was murdered by the state of Georgia. And that was a moment when a lot of people realized that our black president had not lifted a finger to save this innocent brother's life, and that we were going to have to do something if we were going to get racial justice in this country. This is a new book called I Am Troy Davis that's out just now from Haymarket Books. Our last speaker needs little introduction, I believe. I asked him how he wanted to be introduced, and he said, just call me Brother West. Ladies and gentlemen, Cornel West. Brother West. I had to blow you up like that, sorry.
Brother Brian, thank you, Brother Brian. Thank you, Brother Brian. Let's thank Brother Andy for bringing us together here, Busboys and Poets, in the chocolate city of Washington, D.C. Oh, yes, look at all these beautiful faces we see here. Oh, indeed, 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 indeed. I want to thank Brother Aubrey and Sister Farrah for being here, and Sister Marie and Brother Cedric, Sister Callie as well. Brother Davis, salute you, love you. Brother Yearwood on the move, and my cellmate who went to jail with me a number of times, stop and frisk Carl Dix. Give them all a hand, give them all a hand. Oh, yes. There's no doubt that this is a historic day. Anytime you bring so many folk to Sly Stone Core, everyday people together, something's going to happen. And my God, anytime ordinary people straighten their backs up, they're going somewhere because folk can't ride your back unless it's bent. And that's what 63 was all about. But let's keep the history in the right context. It was not dealing with the Negro problem, was dealing with the catastrophe of white supremacy that goes back 400 years. And it has to do with terrorizing a people and traumatizing a people and stigmatizing a people and niggerizing a people. And by niggerize, what I mean is keep us so scared and so afraid and so intimidated. We walk around with our backs down and laughing when it ain't funny and scratching when it don't itch, wearing the mask, just trying to get by rather than straightening our backs up. And that's what happened in 1963. And it wasn't just Martin Luther King Jr. The movement made Martin. Martin didn't make the movement. There's no Martin without Fannie Lou Hamer, without Ella Baker, without Stokely Carmichael, without so many nameless and anonymous ones. And there's certainly no Martin Luther King Jr. without his beloved mama and daddy, Martin Luther King the first and Alberta King. Give them all a hand. That's the tradition that we talking about. Don't believe that hype on corporate media and all of these television stations thinking that somehow Martin dropped out of the sky. No, he comes from a tradition that says that I am who I am because somebody loved me. And I know that's true for me, and I think that's true for you too. We are who we are because somebody cared for us. Somebody targeted us. Somebody was concerned about us enough to sacrifice and serve us in such a way that we can make our move from womb to tomb and leave a blow for freedom and leave a blow for justice. But 1963, we saw the Black Freedom Movement once again straighten up in the face of what? Terror. We have to keep in mind the Black Freedom Movement is an anti-terrorist movement in the face of American terrorism. That's what it is. Because the vicious legacy of white supremacy always says what? Black love is a crime. If you really love black people, then you hate the fact they're being treated unjustly. You can't stand the fact they're being treated unfairly, and you're willing to live and die for them, which means usually in America, you are a criminal. It says that black history is a curse, and black hope is a joke, and black freedom is a pipe dream. That's what white supremacy tried to instill in the hearts and minds of black people so we remain deferential and subservient. That's why I like Marcus Garvey. He always insisted at every march, the leader of the march was the Negro is not afraid. You got to shed your fears, and only love at its deepest level can do it. That's why I want to begin my discourse this evening with Malcolm X. Because Malcolm was in Washington, D.C. in 1963 too, wasn't he? Oh, yes, he was. And what did he call the March on Washington? He called it the Farce on Washington. Brother Malcolm, we love you, you love us. Explain yourself, brother. That's Martin and the others leading the march. He said, no, the march had to go through the White House. It was controlled by the U.S. government. They changed the speech of Brother John Lewis. And they said they would pull the plug if anybody really told a fundamental truth about the depths of white supremacy. And when Martin went off script, like a good black Baptist preacher, they didn't know what to do. Can you imagine if they had pulled that plug right in the middle of I Have a Dream? Because the FBI had the plug. Let's just be clear about that. You can say anything you want about Brother Malcolm. I don't agree with everything. He was a revolutionary Muslim. I'm a revolutionary Christian. Carl Dick's revolutionary communist. We still comrades. Oh, we still comrades. Revolutionary atheists, revolutionary Buddhists like bell hooks. But what the adjective is doing is we have the courage to try to tell the truth. 1963, that same day the great W.B. Du Bois died. In Ghana, he left America. Like Brother Bradley Manning and like Edward Snowden and John Kiriakou, W.B. Du Bois was called an enemy of the state because he had the courage to try to tell the truths about the crimes and the lies of the U.S. government, and they pushed him out. They took his passport away. So when the great A. Philip Randolph stepped up and said, the old man has died, right before I introduced the moral conscience of this nation, Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., you could see the coming together of the generations. And when W. Du Bois was 89 years old, he wrote a novel called The Ordeal of Man's Art. And he said 4 questions I've been wrestling with all my life. And these are questions each and every one of us have to come to terms with. How does integrity face oppression? What does honesty do in the face of deception? What does decency do in the face of insult? How does virtue meet brute force? And I'm so glad that my God made me a free black man. Oh, I'm glad. And I'm glad because in an attempt to strive to integrity, honesty, decency, and virtue in the face of the catastrophe of white supremacy that allows me to love myself, defend myself, and respect myself, and therefore respect others, beginning with the least of these, beginning with our brothers and sisters on Indian reservations, beginning with our poor white brothers and sisters in Appalachia, beginning with our poor brown brothers and sisters in barrios, beginning with our Asian brothers and sisters catching hell. But for me, it begins on the chocolate side of town. And it spills over. And it spills over. And why do I say that? I say that because 1963 was the first time that the nation got a sense of not just Martin Luther King Jr., but the genius of Mahalia Jackson. They got a sense of A. Philip Randolph and Bayard Rustin. They got a sense of John Lewis even giving his curtailed speech. They didn't get a chance to see Stokely Carmichael. He refused to go. He said this is a sanitized middle-class version of the real black movement. I love Stokely Carmichael, Kwame Ture. And we have to be able to embrace a variety of perspectives to do what? To keep the focus on integrity, honesty, decency, and virtue. And why do I say that? Because the fundamental difference between 1963 and 2013 is these days everything and everybody's up for sale. It's a market-driven culture. Just dangle enough money, dangle enough position, dangle enough assets, and folk will come running, which means we don't get too much integrity, honesty, decency, and virtue. You get folk obsessed with having assets, folk obsessed with having wealth and position, but not enough folk like Ella, like Fannie, like Martin, like Malcolm. You can disagree with them, but one thing is for sure, they never sell out. Never. Never. They had integrity. They had decency. They had virtue. They had an honesty. And that's what we got to teach our young folk. Because our young folk these days, they're exposed to all of this culture of superficial spectacle. That's one of the reasons why today, among the major organizers and the major speakers, you didn't have any honest talk about Wall Street. You didn't have any honest talk about oligarchs and plutocrats who have been involved in a money grab among poor people and working people with big banks and big corporations controlling both political parties and reshaping this nation and the whole world in their image. Don't talk about Martin if you're not going to tell the full truth. You didn't have no serious talk about the new Jim Crow and the prison industrial complex. You had some voices early in the morning, but when most of America saw the show. You didn't have a talk about why is it that this vicious criminal system, which itself is criminal, has tried to destroy 2 generations of poor black and brown youth. We ought to be full of righteous indignation. That's a crime against humanity. And there's a connection between Wall Street criminality and the criminality of our criminal justice system. And people say, oh, Brother West, how come you so hard? This is not the time to be polite. No, we got to tell some truths. And as a Christian, I can keep the love in it and still not be polite because I'm mad, I'm angry. I'm full of holy rage. When I look at our precious young people and the ways in which so much of their lives are wasted, unrealized potential, nobody really talking about it. White House, courthouse, even in our churches, we don't have serious prison ministry. Where's the outrage that led toward what was going on in 1963? And my God, when it comes to the empire, oh, when it comes to empirical foreign policy, when it comes to drones, did you hear any of the major speeches talk about drones today? Did they tell you about 221 precious children in Pakistan and Yemen and Somalia who've been killed in the name of the U.S. people? I don't know about you, but for me, a child in Somalia has the same value as a white child in Newtown, Connecticut. I don't know about you, got the same value of a precious black child on the south side of Chicago. Same value of a brown child in East Los Angeles. Oh, yeah. And let us be very clear about this. Even though Malcolm called the March on Washington a farce on Washington, when he left the nation March the 12th, 1964, just a few months after the march, and then he met Martin Luther King Jr. You all seen the picture of both of them with that beautiful smile. On March the 26th, exactly 2 weeks after he left the nation, he said, we got to work together, Brother Martin. I said some things about you I know was harsh, but I was just speaking my mind. I'm a blues man. Sometimes my soul expresses itself in creative manner. And Martin Luther King Jr. called Malcolm on the phone. And you can check the FBI file, June the 27th, 1964. Martin called Malcolm on the phone. He said, Brother Malcolm, I heard you got an idea of taking the United States to the United Nations for the violation of the human rights of black people here and connected with what's going on in Africa. And Martin said, I want to be there with you. Can you imagine what our history would have been like if they had come in together in front of the United Nations to expose the crimes and the lies of the U.S. government? And it was just a few weeks later that they tried to poison Malcolm in Cairo because he was presenting the Declaration to the Organization of African States. Oh, yes, we need to know this history, y'all. We don't need no sanitized, sterilized, Santa Clausified history. We got to keep it funky. Keep it real. And that's why when I heard the speeches today, I said to myself, oh, look at the magnificent majesty of the everyday people who are full of rage in the face of not just the legacy of white supremacy, not just the legacy of Wall Street oligarchic power, not just the legacy of the prison industrial complex or the corporate media multiplex full of lies and deceptions and miseducation, but the people were still coming forward. And they were looking for voices. They were looking for leaders to speak something that spoke to the depths of who they were and the suffering and the creativity. And I want to submit to you, and I'm going to sit down, that I think our mainstream leaders disappointed the people today. They disappointed the people today. Now, I'm glad they brought them together. I've known Brother Al Sharpton for, 30 years now. We wrestled together, police brutality and so forth and so on. But that brother's gone through some changes. It's true. And he has become the bona fide house Negro of the Obama plantation. Not a critical word about the Obama administration. Nothing about the Wall Street bailout. Nothing about the relative absence of words on the prison industrial complex. And now that Eric Holder's talking about it, they still are against the retrospective application of the drug decision made that would allow our brothers and sisters who've been in there for years to have that law apply to them so they can get out. Don't give me your bait and switch strategy. Say one thing and do something else. And they say, oh, Brother West, you always so hard on the president. No. I'm doing the best I could do to love the people enough to tell them the truth. That's what the bottom line is. That's what the bottom line is. And you bring all those people together around the world. What did they say if you're looking from Latin America? Was there a word for our Latin American brothers and sisters? No, it made us look so parochial. What about the Middle East? What about our Palestinian brothers and sisters dealing with Israeli occupation? We're too parochial. What about Syria? What about Egypt? What about Korea? We are cosmopolitan international people, and black people at our best have always had something to say to the whole world, not just voting rights for us now. Oh, yeah. So what we need is to keep the variety. See, I'm losing my voice. The variety of our voices intense, like the Negro anthem. Lift every voice. And keep alive the coming together of that radical Martin Luther King Jr. and that radical Malcolm X and that radical Ella Baker and that radical Fannie Lou Hamer. Don't believe the hype of the mainstream media that tries to say that all of that rage can be contained by those on the Obama plantation. No, it's going to flow over. It's going to flow over. Everybody is accountable, including the social forces behind the White House, who are Wall Street oligarchs and big corporations that are global and international. That's the tradition we got to keep alive. Thank you all so much.